presented by Muhammad Akbar, by Professor Farhad Nasreen on the politics of Muslim identity in the court of Emperor Akbar, Emperor Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar. And we will have a presentation, and then afterwards we will have questions, answers, and comments for 8 minutes. So without further ado, Professor Nasreen, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, sir. So nice to be here with you this evening. I thank the organizers. Sir, how many minutes do I have for this presentation?
I think you should think of 12 minutes, and then if it's a little bit longer, it's okay, but 12 minutes, aim for 12 minutes.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much, sir. Right, so today I thought we were going to, I'm going to present before you some ideas about what was happening in Akbar's court as far as the Muslim identity of the people around him is concerned. Now, for those who are not so familiar with the history of India, let me just quickly tell you that Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar was one of the greatest of the Mughal emperors. He had a long run of reign. And one of the most important things that he did was the formulation of the idea of Sulh Kul. Sulh Kul implying that absolute peace or universal peace or peace with all. So that is his major contribution as far as, you know, we can understand history in the present context. It is one of the biggest things that comes from Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar. Now, speaking of identity, when we think of identity, there are two aspects of it. That, you know, that how do we perceive ourselves? What do we think that who we are? That is one thing. That is our identity, our own perception. And the other identity is how others perceive us. So what is the other identity? Now, often it so happens, you know, that we keep struggling to tell people who we are, as in how we perceive ourselves, what is our self-identity. That is one aspect of it. And the other aspect is that sometimes we have overlapping identities, of course, you know, because there are a number of roles that we play in our lives. So then sometimes there are multiple identities in a single person, or even a single group may have, or it may play different identities at different points in time. Now, as far as, you know, the rise of the Muslim ruling houses in Hindustan is concerned, we find that a number of them actually used Islam as a political slogan, as something to kind of enthuse warriors to come and fight for them, something like a slogan to legitimize the various, you know, the invasions that were happening. Now, as far as Islam itself is concerned, that is Islam as in the book Quran and what is contained therein, and the lived Islam or the life of the Muslims. So we first have to understand that those two things can be put into two different spaces. They may not necessarily be the same. Now, in this context, when you think of Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar, he had a legacy of you know, a certain degree of liberality, because if you look at his grandfather, the famous Zahiruddin Muhammad Babur, or if you look at his father Nasiruddin Humayun, they were both people who were liberal, and you know, they had as far as religion is concerned, they didn't have a very aggressive kind of a attitude. Besides them, if you look at the more of the historicity and we go behind, then some of the sultans, as in Alauddin Khilji, also had a liberal attitude, and he opened the doors of, you know, recruitment to a lot of people. Now, when Akbar did this, when he came to power, he realized that if he had a vision that he's going to have a huge empire and he's going to occupy a lot of lands, he knew that he will have to be inclusive. So a lot of people had to be included within the ranks of the nobility and the higher, you know, end. Now, as far as the Muslim orthodoxy was concerned, a lot of them, say for example, the Uzbeks and the Chagatais, especially who were from the old bracket of the nobility coming from Humayun's period, they had a sense of entitlement. So they thought that if we have, you know, we have regained the empire, then we have a right to be at the top. We have to be the creme de la creme of this structure now. That is something that Akbar was not ready to do, because he does experiment with a lot of things. And, you know, eventually, the policy that crystallizes in his mind is this, that if he has to succeed as an emperor, he has to have an all-inclusive policy. And this was not something which he decided overnight, or an idea that just suddenly emerged. He experimented a lot with, how and what is the right balance to strike between the various identities he had to juggle with. And this final crystallization comes with the Ibadat Khana debates, because he had created a Ibadat Khana. The debates used to happen. Initially, the debates were limited to just the Muslims and the various sects, and then it became open for everybody. So you had Buddhists, you had Zoroastrians, you had Christians, and of course you had a whole lot of Hindus whom he interacted with. And eventually he thought that we have to have a policy where we include everybody, not just into the political system, but also in a spiritual system. And this spiritual system was going to derive its strength from the idea of Tawheed-e-Ilahi, that is the unity of God. So that is the idea from which he is going to derive the spiritual ideology. The other ideology which was very important for him practically also, was this: that the non-Muslim ruling class in Hindustan, which was already existent, he had not created it, they were already there, the Rajas were already there. So therefore, he had to give them another sense of identity, which was perhaps to be greater than their identity of being the Hindu zamindars of Hindustan. And this greater identity was that they had to be the officers of the great, grand Mughal Empire, and they all had to be proud of it. So he created, in fact, another identity, and he wanted both the Muslims and the non-Muslims, or the creme de la creme, to identify as officers of the Mughal Empire, and that identity had to take a precedence over any other identity. That is what he was gunning for. Now, this was not easy to do, because a lot of Muslim orthodoxy felt that he was actually taking away a slice from what they owned, and they had a sense of entitlement. Now, this resentment manifested itself in the form of various rebellions that happened. There were a series of rebellions which happened in Akbar's period, and surprisingly, most of the rebels are not the Hindus. They are not the Shia Muslims. They are, in fact, the Chagtai Sunni Muslims, technically belonging to the same sectarian niche to which Akbar himself belonged. They are the people who are rebelling because they feel that he's stealing something that they deserved. And one of the clear manifestations, in fact, something which is recorded, which is crystal clear, is a book. It's actually a 3-volume book, which is known as the Muntakhabut Tawarikh, written by Mullah Abdul Qadir Badayuni, who notes that how Akbar hated, according to him, quote unquote, Akbar hated Islam. Now, the question is this, that did Badayuni, who himself claimed to be a mullah, did he really understand what Islam itself was about? Because there are two parts in a religion. One is ritualism, and especially when you're talking about Islam, I mean, I'm pretty scared of talking about Islam in front of Professor Bruce, but I am kind of daring to do that. So there's a huge chunk in the Quran itself which has to do with humanism and with lived things. I mean, how do you live in your everyday life? How do you interact with people? How do you treat the poor? How honest you are supposed to be? All those things, they occupy a big part. And as far as the rituals are concerned, that it's a part, right? It's a part there, right? So now you find that although Mullah Abdul Qadir is a great critic of Akbar, and not just Akbar, he's going to also criticize Abul Fazl, who's the right-hand man of Akbar. He's going to criticize Faizi, who's Abul Fazl's brother. And he's going to criticize Sheikh Mubarak, who was the father of Abul Fazl, the author of Akbarnama, and Faizi. So he's going to say that these guys are opportunists. And just because you find that this ruler of ours has gone astray, and that is why they are making good use of him. Now, and he's going to not, this is the Muntakhabut Tawarikh, is a 3-volume, huge, a text which he wrote secretly. Nobody knew that he's writing this. This will come to the knowledge of the royal house only after Akbar is dead. So it is in Jahangir's period that the book is finally actually discovered. And then you find, when you think of this whole situation and the idea of the Sulaykul and the Tawhid-e-Ilahi, you find that it was not just the Muslim orthodoxy, but the orthodoxy cutting across all religions, which was resisting the idea of the Tawhid-e-Ilahi. So it was never, ever easy to sell humanism. It was not easy to sell humanism ever. It's going to take a lot of effort. It's going to take a lot of sacrifices. It's not easy. I'll give you one quick example. When when the Sulaykul and the Tawhid-e-Ilahi was being propagated, Akbar sent an invitation to just two of the great Rajput leaders of his time to convert to this club that he had created. So it wasn't a religion really, it was a spiritual club. And there is a very famous reply which Man Singh, who was not just a very important officer of the Mughal Empire, but also a very close friend and associate of Akbar, who wrote back to him, he said that in case if you are asking my religion, then let me tell you that I am a Hindu. And in case if you're asking me to die fighting for you, that I can do. I can die fighting for you because I'm loyal to you. I work for you. I serve you. But that is another thing. But as far as you're talking about my religion, I am a Hindu. That is what he replied back to Akbar. So for Akbar, to create a sense of zero religious identity, despite all the power that he had, despite whatever, he could have offered people if they agreed with him in entirety, people were not ready to leave the orthodox element in their own respective identities. So it wasn't easy at all. The other important thing that, in fact, there is Athar Abbas Rizvi who writes about Sufism, and he, in that context, he also writes about Akbar, and he says that Akbar was basically, he had understood the spirit of Islam, and he says that it was Ibra wa tabarra namuda, that there was no need for ritualism and show. That is what Akbar had understood from Islam. And the idea of humanism that he was preaching was not because he was not a Muslim. He was preaching the idea of humanism because he was a Muslim who had actually understood what Islam is about. That is now within this context, if I may just have one more minute, I don't know, Professor Bruce, whether I have exceeded my time. I'm not too sure.
Well, you have 2 more minutes. 2 more minutes.
Okay, right. So I'll just add one quick thing, that Akbar was very inquisitive always, and he was ready to experiment and learn new things. And there are a number of examples of that. But there's one, the importance of, of growing and keeping on the spirit to learn and imbibe good things from anybody and everybody around you. I'll just go back to Kashful Mehjoob, which is a very famous book on Sufism coming from Hindustan, Lahore, 11th century AD, written by Ali Hujweri. In this, there is a conversation between two Sufis, Junaid and Shibli. So Junaid was, doing something, and Shibli was passing by his house, and Shibli asked him that, my friend, what have you learned new? What is the new thing that you've learned? And Junaid said that I've learned that whoever seeks shall find. And Shibli said, no, my friend, whoever finds shall seek. So once you have the wisdom, then the search begins. And there is no question of the search ever ending. So if you look at the life of Akbar, you find that he had a number of challenges. His challenges, beginning from political, they turn into personal, but he never gives up. That is something which is incredible about him. And the interesting part is that if you ask the Muslims, a lot of them, if you ask them which of the Mughal emperor do they hate, it would be Akbar. Because the Muslim orthodoxy would never give credit to Akbar for the kind of popularity that the Muslim culture and what we say the Islamicate, the creation and the profession of Islamicate, the contribution of Akbar therein is never recognized and celebrated by the Muslim orthodoxy even today. So I think we need to look at Akbar differently and perhaps let people know about him, who he really was. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for this stimulating talk to begin. And I deliberately asked Professor Farah to limit herself to 12 minutes so that we could have some more time for comments or questions or answers. So I think the way this will work is right, Rajiv, that people will just ask her directly. I do not need to intervene. Is that correct?
Yeah, they can directly ask if they have no given any chat in the chat question. So they can directly ask.
So the floor is open for others. And while we're waiting for other people to comment on Professor Farhad, let me just say that I have read the Kashf al-Mahjub of Sheikh Ali Hujri, but that the discussion between Shibli and Junaid escaped me, but now I will never forget it. Because this is precisely the dualities that we've been talking about that are characteristic of identity. There's not only being, but becoming. And you aptly described it when you said that on the one hand, there's this notion that when you seek something, you find it, and that's the end. But I love the response is that once you found something, then you keep on seeking. So ishq is about the endless quest. It's not about the consummate love.
Very true. Very true, sir.
Professor Nasrin, let me ask a question. Actually, it's not a question, but I really enjoyed your lecture, and I think we had a communication also. And then I passed on you an article of Professor Lawrence, and
Yes.
I'm really, because I'm working on Kabir and the Sulakul, which was founded or drafted by I'm forgetting the name. Sorry.
The idea from Abul Fazl, but
Abu Fazl, yes.
yeah,
Abu Fazl. So he drafted the Sulakul, and what I learned about this, Professor Harbans Mukhia, he was mentioning about him that his father was very much inspired by Kabir, and that's what he was transmitting his knowledge into Abu Fazl. So so I would like to read your paper. I mean, when you presented this, it fascinated me because I'm working on Kabir and focusing on the South Asian studies to understand this whole history. So I will be very glad that if you share your work.
If you're interested in Kabir and you're looking at syncretism and you know how there are these chains of connections between various thought processes, if you have a look at Amir Khusro, say for an example,
Yeah.
you know, when he writes about this concept of vireh. Vireh is separation from the beloved, right? So when you have this concept of vireh, it's very critical to also ishq, because when you're separated from the beloved, you are, you know, in great lot of distress, and that is why the Sufis celebrate death, because they think that is the day when they finally meet the beloved. Yeah. So if you read Amir Khusro, there's a very famous poem by him which goes like this: no, zihale miski makun tagaful dorae na banaye batiya. Right. So and it says kitabe hijra na dar mein jana lehu kahe lagaye chatiya. Yeah. So you know, if you think of that, and then if you think of now this Amir Khusro writing in a Sufistic, you know, backdrop, but a lot of these ideas you would find also in the Bhakta Kavis, say for example the Krishnite Bhakta Kavis of the Braj region. So you would have that in Kumban Das, or you may find that in Sur Das, in a whole lot of them. Parmanand Das, all of them write the same kind of ideas. So there is a connect of ideas of commonality, which is what I think we need to hold on to. It's very important to hold on to the common space that we can, and you know, to hold on to humanism basically, because that is very important. And I think, and I think in that Akbar contributed, and he was so advanced for his times that the kind of, the kind of society that he was visualizing, it has still not arrived. We are still waiting for the arrival of the Sulekul. So we're still waiting for it to come.
So Professor, if I ask you the question that how you depict that from Kabir to Sulakul or to Akbar's court, so how you will narrate this?
Well, see, Kabir is somebody who's actually a monotheistic bhakta saint, right? And you find, you know, that he condemns the formalism of every religion. because he says that no, formalism is bad because it divides people. Ritualism is bad because it divides people. And that is what Kabir is talking about. The other important thing that Kabir, a reading of Kabir will tell you, is about the economic exploitation of the people by the richer sections. There's an economic aspect also in Kabir, because when he compares the, say for example, when he says that God is going to call everyone to answer for their deeds, then he compares God with the Mahajan, who's going to call one day because we are all debtors and we have to, repay the debt. So that becomes very important for him. I'll give you one line from Kabir, which I'm sure you must have heard. It goes like this, that Jhini Jhini Bini Chadariya, Kahe ka Tana, Kahe ka Bana, Kaun Tar se Bini Chadariya. And then the last line of this goes like this, ki Das Kabir Dhyan kar rakhyo, das so for those who don't understand this, I would just translate very quickly that Kabir is saying that our body is like a piece of cloth which is so delicate, and there are these threads which are running, so these threads are so damn delicate, and I can't understand how you have woven this cloth, oh God. And then finally he says that my cloth, my soul, I've kept it so pure and so clean that I have returned it back to you just as the way it was when you had made it. That is what it means, So he is completely talking about purity and, internal purity and peace. And that, I think, in a world where there is so much of competition and so much of negativity, we need to hold on to these kind of ideas and propagate them. Let them come out from, from intellectual forums like these to the common man. So how do we simplify them and, disseminate them everywhere?
Well, thank you, Professor Farhad. And I think that it's wonderful that you gave us not only insight at Akbar, but also for people who are not familiar with Arabic, Akbar and Kabir are related etymologically as well as historically. So Kabir is the first and Akbar is the greatest, but they both belong to Kaf, Ba, Ra. And you have given us the weaving of Kabir and Akbar in a way that will delight everybody, but especially Rajiv. So I hate to leave the comedy and the wonderful effervescence of Akbar and go into the Uyghurs and Kurds, but that's the nature of our seminars, that we need to keep on moving. So I must excuse me for ending the conversation and then calling on Rizki Amalia to please tell us something about identity politics of Uyghurs and Kurds and what they have in common and what they have different. So Rizki, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Lawrence. First of all, everyone, apologize me because I have some connection problem with my laptop, so I will be sharing my presentation from my phone. So because of that reason as well, I won't be able to open my video, if that's okay.
Sure. We would like to see you as well as hear you, but we're happy to hear you.
Sure. All right. But hopefully after my presentation, I will be able to show myself. So a moment, I will be sharing my screen. Okay. First, I would like to thank so much for Umran for organizing this symposium and professor that have chosen my paper, despite I know that it's far from perfect. Today, I will be talking about my paper that analyzes the identity politics of the Uyghurs and the Kurds in terms of its similarities and differences. So we can start. This is what I'll be talking about. First of all, I will give you a brief introduction of my analysis, what is the background, what is my study objective, and then in the section 1, I will be talking about the leadership analysis of Rabia Kadar and Abdullah Öcalan. For your information, Rabia Kadar is the prominent leader of the Uyghur people, and Abdullah Öcalan is the leader of the PKK group that belongs to the Kurdish people. And the other section, I will be talking about the organized groups that belong to these two minority groups. And if I have time, I will be talking about the international response analysis to the matter of Uyghur and Kurdish question. So if we are to give a little background here, the Kurds and the Uyghurs are two Muslim minority groups with similar struggle to achieve the right of self-determination, while Kurdish people are actually, I think, more fortunate compared to the Uyghurs because living in Turkey, Kurdish people do enjoy freedom and equal opportunity as citizens, but the condition for the Uyghurs is quite opposite. I think it's important for me to mention here that my focus about when I talk about Kurdish people, I talk about the Kurdish people who live in Turkey. That's my focus analysis. So my objective is to analyze their identity politics from the aspect of leadership, organized groups, and how international community respond to these cases. So talking about leadership analysis, I read Rabia Kadar's autobiography and 3 books of Abdullah Öcalan to be able to do what we call discourse analysis under language. And I come to the conclusion that, first of all, of course, they have their rhetoric of freedom. But for example, what makes Kader different from Öcalan is that she doesn't possess particular ideology. So Kader defines her freedom and the freedom of her people as a single unit. And for her, freedom means self-determination and the establishment of an independent state. But she herself never mentioned what is going to be the name of this independent state. So instead, she always say the freedom of Uyghur nation. But otherwise, I mean, on the other hand, Öcalan is very much influenced by the leftist ideology. So, for example, he's very against imperialisms, and he thinks that imperialism is what causes the suffering of Kurdish people until today. And I think there's some inconsistency in his definition of freedom. For example, in one of his books, he mentioned that the freedom means the freedom of Kurdistan. And I think we have to emphasize here that he said the freedom of Kurdistan instead of the freedom of Kurdish people. So I think it's very much clear that he is very much into self-determination and the creation of an independent state. But in other writing of his book, he said that the meaning of freedom also means the right regarding culture, language, and political participation. So I see a little bit of paradox and a shift of definitions of freedom according to him. The next one is ascribe status of leadership. I borrowed this term from sociology. So ascribe status in sociology means the status that a person acquires since birth. So what I mean by ascribe status of leadership is that Kadar and Öcalan show themselves as the leader of their people since they were born. So for example, Kader considers herself as part of the famous Uyghur heroes with full possessions of her dignity. And she always say that she is the daughter of the people and the land. And she also expresses herself as the savior of her people and that she was chosen for the status. Similarly, Öcalan also relates himself to the story of the heroes. For example, he draws special attention to ancient Mesopotamia's Epic of Gilgamesh. In the story of Epic of Gilgamesh, there is a hero named Enkidu, and Öcalan relates himself to Enkidu. For example, he sees himself to be destined to save people, just like Enkidu did in the Epic of Gilgamesh. And I think what makes them very different from each other is their chosen way, like the way they reach their goal. So Kadar is a notable woman. She is a wealthy businesswoman, so she struggled to liberate her people with money and dignity. For example, she built a department store where she gave opportunity for the Uyghur families to improve and develop their economic conditions, for example. And she is also a representative in the National People Congress from Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, where she actually had the chance to be more vocal about what was happening with her people in Xinjiang. But on the opposite, Öcalan did not have the same chance to represent his people through a strategic position in the government agencies. So his alternative choice is rather radical by establishing an anti-government party, which is known to be PKK or Kurdistan Workers' Party. The second analysis is the analysis of the organized groups. I categorize them into two, the peaceful one and the radical one. For the Uyghurs, we have the World Uyghur Congress as the peaceful organized group, and we have East Turkistan Islamic Movement as the radical one. And for the Kurdish, we have Kurdistan National Congress, and the radical one, we have the Kurdistan Workers' Party. So if we talk about the Kurdish organized group, first of all, we have the World Uyghur Congress. They have their headquarters in Germany, and they focus on raising the Uyghur-related issues in many different national and international forums and engage with European Union as well as Human Rights Council and UN Minority Forum. And I think they're quite successful because they send reports to Human Rights Council for the Universal Period Review, for example. Universal Period Review is the process that involves a review of the human rights records of all United Nations member states. And thanks to the report, China is due to be reviewed in 2023. And we have East Turkistan Islamic movement as a radical one that has been closely attached to neighboring terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda and Taliban. It aims at establishing the fundamentalist Islamic states of East Turkestan. In 2020, lately, United States of America removed this organization from the list of terror group because we're not sure if the group is active or not, because right now, I think, according to my analysis and study, East Turkestan Islamic movement is more active in Syria to go fighting against Assad's regime rather than in Xinjiang itself. And if we talk about the Kurds organized group, we have Kurdistan National Congress as the peaceful one, but it has a close affiliation with PKK actually. And I think that this is the important reason why it is unable to attract many supporters. And of course, they have the similar strategy, the struggle for self-determination, and they define this as their national strategy. They also have similar tactics like the World Uyghur Congress. They do conferences, dialogues, writing campaigns and reports and things like that. And also we have Kurdistan Workers' Party here. I think it is very important to emphasize here that although PKK is very popular in the Kurdish issue, it merely represents the majority of the Kurds because there's inconsistency in their aim whether to create an independent state or simply to seek freedom. The latest interview that was done by BBC to the soldiers of PKK, they said that they only want to have the greater freedom in Turkey, for example, but instead of, if we look at the reality where Turkish people actually provide equal opportunity for the Kurdish people, PKK keep doing their terror activities. So there's a paradox itself in their activities. So I will be talking briefly about the role of international community here. The first one, if we talk about the Uyghur case, 22 countries signed joint statement on July 10, 2019, condemning China's human rights violation in Xinjiang. And lately, the USA, Canada, and Netherlands recognized the event as genocide. And for the Kurdish question, we have, I think, European Union as the most prominent one because European Union's Copenhagen criteria was imposed to Turkey, for example, when Turkey was admitted as the candidate member of the European Union. And thanks to this Copenhagen criteria, for example, Turkey had to improve the conditions of the minority groups within its country. And of course, PKK is recognized as a terrorist organization by some countries, including the USA, European Union, Canada, New Zealand, Iran, Iraq, and Turkey itself. And if we come to the conclusion by looking at these three aspects, we can conclude that although the Uyghurs and the Kurds possess the identical aim of self-determination, their prominent leaders approach their goal differently, and the organized groups, however, also share similar tactics with different results. And although the third parties from international community have interfered with the case, their actions are only limited to the improvement of their rights and freedom. Meanwhile, the exact aim to create self-determination, to create an independent state remains impossible. I think that's all for me. Thank you so much for listening.
Well, thank you for this fascinating expose, Rizki. It's very interesting to hear this, especially in the aftermath of listening to the discussion we had with Professor Farhad about Akbar. So one of the things that I think would interest a lot of people is how the difference which you amplify between Uyghurs and Kurds is now something a problem in the 21st century that wasn't a problem in the 16th and 17th century. That is, we move from empires to nation states. So the whole rhetoric of what it is to struggle and what it is to have identity in the 21st century relates to how one positions oneself either within or beyond or against other nation states. And this is the plight of the Uyghurs and the Kurds. And I just wanted to bring up something which I want to ask you, that in terms of what has happened since the end of World War II and the formation of independent nation states, the only break-off state, of course, has been Bangladesh, that succeeded in becoming an independent state from West Pakistan in 1971. And then there was, of course, East Timor, which became an independent state in the eastern part of the Indian Ocean. And that was in 1999, and not till 2002 that it attained full independence. So I guess the question I would have for you is, how do you think of the nation state as both an opportunity and a barrier for the Uyghurs and Kurds?
Thank you so much, Professor. So as you mentioned that, yes, that's true. I think nation state is, of course, one of the obstacles for this Uyghur people and Kurdish people to have their own independent state. And if you look at their populations, I mean, for example, the Kurdish population is about 20 millions in Turkey and 40 millions in all, and Uyghur population is 13 million people in the Xinjiang Autonomous Region. But of course, I think it's quite dilemma to talk whether they're going to be able to form this independent state, because we have, for example, international politics, we have also territorial integrity principles that, of course, also go against these self-determinations itself.
Well, thank you. Are there others who have questions or comments for Rizki?
I just want to add something. Just
Yes,
a comment.
please.
What I humbly observe in the era of nation states is a challenge to integrate minorities within their systems. And I think focusing on that can help us maybe understand, I think this is the next panel's topic, but like identity in the post-human, right? It seems like it's a common theme, whether in many countries, even in Pakistan, there are similar issues for certain ethnic groups. So yeah, that's it.
You want to respond to that, Rizki?
Thank you, Najam. I think, yes, I do agree with you that one of the obstacles is that how a nation state can integrate minority groups. And also, I think one of the reasons, because minority groups is also very diverse within itself. So that's why it is very hard for the nation state to let's say, face their demands. Or for example, in Kurdish people as well here, many Kurdish people actually want to be part of Turkey, but some of them also want to be independent. So yeah, it is hard for the nation state itself to fulfill their needs or their demands, all of them. Thank you.
So I just want to bring in one observation from a part of the world that we've not mentioned yet, which is the Philippines. And there's been a lot of interesting writing about minorities in the Philippines. And one of the most interesting is to say that the Philippines, like many of the other, including the Uyghurs in China and the Kurds in the different parts of Turkey and Iran and Syria, that the issue is that the nation state always has a hyphen. It's not nation state, one word, or nation and state, it's nation hyphen state. And there's always the difficulty that the nation gets collapsed into one group for the purposes of the state, when in fact it's always multiple groups. And minority and majority is always an index of power as much as of geography or of topography.
Thank you, Professor.
I want to learn about this. I'm wondering about this also. I mean, throughout your lectures, and recently I was watching this lecture from McGill University, where Professor Salvatore was chairing. I am forgetting the name of the
everything's off now.
Doctor. So this nation state, the notion of nation state has become has not brought a solution. It has been become very problematic, and
Mhm.
this is a very serious issue that today, even it was in India as well, even after the independence, India got independence. It was with Bangladesh, and even it was with the South India and North India. So this brings a conflict. Every time it brings a conflict, and it is not a solution for humanity. So when we talk about the solution of humanity, it is not bringing even solution, even like in case of Turkey, creating the new state of Kurdistan. And even when it was the in the very first place, it was a Turkey altogether. It is not a bringing a solution. What will be the scope of humanity in terms of identity building, the nation, or how it will work?
Um, if I may answer that question, Raja, I think well, to me, in my personal opinion, I think it will create more chaos in the world if we create an independent state for every minority groups, because minority groups is available everywhere. Like in every nation, there is always this kind of case. So in terms of creating a solution, like to be able to create a Kurdistan, or to be able to create I mean, if Kurdish people can create an independent state, and it will encourage many minority groups in all over the world to do the same thing. I think that's also one of the reasons why it is still impossible for us to have all nation state for all minority. So I think more like of humanitarian, I mean, more better solution is how we can integrate them into the nation state, and how we can provide the freedom, and how we can have a dialogue of how two parties will fulfill their own demands and needs. Thank you.
Well, Rizky, thank you very much for a stimulating paper, and also for the questions and answers and comments that everybody had. And I'm really mindful of the fact that all these are connected, even as Akbar is connected to the Uyghurs and the Kurds. So now we are going into another group which combines all the issues we just raised and puts them in another plot. And that's, of course, the Afghans. And so I'm really very happy now to turn to Rajashri Ghosh and to have a presentation on the issue of Afghans from medieval India. And the title is A Lost State, A Found Identity. So, of course, all of us want to know what was lost and what was found between the state and the identity. So for that discussion, I look forward to the presentation of Rajashri Ghosh, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor. And today I'm here to talk about the Afghans of medieval India, who have largely remained on the margins of the political culture of this period, right? It was dominated mainly by Turks, and then by Iranians and the indigenous Rajputs. They are the main ethnic groups of whom we hear every now and then. There are two major reasons that can be identified for this lack of space that has been given to Afghans. First is that no such texts were commissioned by Afghan rulers, specifically the Lodis, the Surs, who ruled from Delhi, and the Karanis, who ruled from Bengal. And what instead we are left with in the pre-16th century is a series of texts that leave a very negative imagery of the Afghans. If I may share my screen, then I can give you a glimpse of just a minute. I think that is visible, right? Yeah. So I can give you all a glimpse of the kind of imagery that authors like Minaj-e-Siraj Juzjani or Amir Khusro have left for us on the Afghans, right? If you could all just go through that. And in the meantime, what I would like to point out is these comments on the Afghans clearly point out to the cultural marginalization of the Afghans in the beginning from the 12th to up to the 15th century. And what we see is that the Afghans never became a part of the urban literary centers. They were always on the frontiers, either fighting against the invading Mongols or on the frontier of the capital of Delhi, right? So they never became a part of the urban Persianate culture. So now one might expect that this one-sided perception to have persisted unchallenged, but the presence of a series of texts from 1570 onwards helps us to change the picture. Now, one of the first texts that comes into light in this context is known as the Vakyat-e-Mushtaqi. It is titled as the Vakyat-e-Mushtaqi, and it was originally circulating in an oral form. It is much later that it assumed a literary, written, tangible form. Right, so even if we have the first manuscript from 1570, it is quite possible that the contents of the text was circulating much prior to that. Pardon me for my voice. Okay. So what happens is that there are certain direct anecdotes. It is a book full of anecdotes, but there are certain direct anecdotes which challenge some of these biases that you can see from Amir Khosrow's extract. One of the most prominent anecdotes is on the physical appearance of the Lodi Sultan, specifically Sikandar Lodi. Right, we have an anecdote where Sheikh Hassan is captured by the beauty of Sikandar Lodi. But what is interesting to note is that Sikandar Lodi, instead of accepting the compliments gracefully, ends up maltreating him. Now, this unexpected reaction, which stems from this prejudiced perception that has been enforced on Afghans for centuries, undergoes a change, a transformation in a following anecdote, right? So there what we see is that Sikandar Lodi refuses to trade his genetics for that he had obviously acquired on account of being an Afghan for a beard that he was expected to grow as a sultan of the Islamic world. So clearly what is happening is that the Afghans are now refusing to allow others to target them based on their appearances, right? So this is the first shift, prominent shift that we see. What then happens is that the Afghans are also being ridiculed for their language, as you can see from this paragraph, right? So you see that there's again an anecdote where Behlul Lodi, the Afghan Sultan, overhears a mullah questioning their religious beliefs and the language, the Afghan language that they used. So what happens is that Behlul Lodi, instead of walking away from this kind of charge, he confronts the mullah and he asks him to introspect into the accusations that are hurled at the Afghans, and he clarifies their allegiance towards Islam. Similarly, again, something similar is evident when the Afghans are accused of displaying inappropriate behavior in political spaces, right? As you can see from this excerpt from the Babur Nama, that the Afghans were clearly being accused of not being aware of how to behave in political spaces. But again, we have an anecdote where we see that not only the Afghans were very, very aware of what qualifies as inappropriate and inappropriate behavior in political spaces, but also how they used it to get the better of their political rivals, right? So we also have I'm not going into too much of details because due to time restrictions. But what we see throughout the Waqiat-e-Mushtaqi is that there are multiple anecdotes where you see that these externally enforced prejudices on Afghans are being effectively challenged every now and then, right? So that is how there's this first layer of challenge to the Afghan identity is formed. Now, apart from formulating such direct responses, this text also gives the space to challenge the Persianate ideals of kingship, right? So we have some strange claims that the Afghan sultans make, right? So they are willing to give away their throne to please their nobles, or they are using the assistance of jinns to keep themselves abreast of the developments in the kingdom. So now these are obviously not to be taken literally at their face value, but they should be recognized as an attempt to step outside the political culture that had marginalized the Afghans for centuries. And how, despite of stepping outside this political realm, the Persianate political realm, the Afghans were able to build a very successful regime that lasted for more than a century. Right? So if we shift to a second text, which is now better known as the Tariq Shahi, but it was originally known as the Tohfa-e-Akbar Shahi because it was written on the orders of Akbar. It is claimed so by the author Abbas Khan Sarwani. Now, this text essentially focuses on the rise and rule of Sher Shah Suri, who is famed not just for defeating Humayun twice and driving the Mughals out of the subcontinent, but also credits him with the foundation of several administrative and economic reforms, which were then continued by the Mughals. Now, throughout, though this text at first glance appears to have been an attempt to preserve the glorious history of Sher Shah and how he got the Afghans together to bring the Afghans back to power, but what we gradually realize as we go on reading the text that Abbas Khan Sarwani was trying to ensure that the glory of his clan, he descended from a very, very famous clan, would not be lost. And this becomes evident when he is introduced to Akbar at the Mughal court, but his illustrious lineage is not recognized. So there is this fear of losing out on on his identity of being a descendant of an illustrious lineage that triggers him to write this text. Right? So what he does very, very cleverly, I must say, is that he inserts all his relatives, not just as the nobles of Sher Shah, but as witnesses of his rule and of his deeds. So to anybody who is reading this text back then or even now, they become a very, very integral part of being a witness to what happened, right? And also vouching for the credibility of the text. So though they are not the main protagonists of the text, but their presence cannot be overlooked. So that is how he ensures that the history of his clan is not lost. The third set of texts that I would like to talk about are titled as the Tariq Shahi and the Tariq Daudi. Right? Both of these texts were written by anonymous writers. We don't know anything about them apart from their names. But what is interesting is both of them were related to the Afghan ruler of Bengal, Daud Shah Karani. And while one claims to have been commissioned by him, the other is claimed to have been dedicated to him, right? So it is of consequence to note that both these texts came into existence at least 25 years after the death of his of their patron, Dod Shah. Now, and also what is further interesting is that both these texts record their familiarity with Tabaqat-e-Nasiri, the text that I referred to here, which also despises the Afghans, and the Tariq Shahi. And what is common between both of them is that both of them belong to the Tariq genre of history writing, right? Which is recognized as the Persianate form of history writing. Now, this initially appears to be indicative of the Afghans' willingness to recognize the superiority of the Persianate tradition. But at the same time, what we shouldn't forget is that Dod Shah, the patron of both these texts, was a fierce enemy of the Mughal regime. He died fighting them, right? He died while facing the Mughals on the battlefield. Now, also what sustains our suspicion is that these texts chose to acknowledge not all sources that they used, right? So they acknowledged sources like the Tabqat-e-Akbari, which stands just second to Akbar's chronicle, the Akbarnama. And what they do not acknowledge is the Waqiyat-e-Mushtaqi, right? But what is interesting is when we do a comparative reading of these texts, we can see clearly that these texts heavily depend on the Waqiyat-e-Mushtaqi, even if they do not acknowledge the text. So what
are you coming close to winding up? We need to wind up in about 2 minutes.
I'm almost done, Professor.
Okay.
So how do we make sense of all these contradictions? The first is that were the Afghans willing to submit their agency, or were they asserting their choice of stepping away from the Persianate tradition? Not just because they were unable to make sense of it, but as they were unwilling to give up on their individual identity, right? So both of these texts do not show that, they show that the Afghans were not really willing to give up their identity, but at the same time, they were communicating their ability to understand Persianate traditions as well. So this kind of, assertion of identity from below, because none of these texts are being commissioned by any ruler. All of them are commissioned either by some anonymous writer or by people who had very modest means of, who were very modest, who were in very modest services, right? Just like the case of Abbas Khan Sarwani. So what comes out of this entire exercise of trying to identify the Afghan construction of Afghan identity is that it is an effort from below, rather than any kind of assertion of Afghan identity from above. We see that the entire spectrum of whatever kind of negotiation on Afghan identity that happens in the 16th and 17th centuries comes from below, and it happens at various levels with various kinds of intentions, right? So that is what my paper was about. Thank you.
Well, thank you for this very stimulating and full paper about Afghan identity and how it has survived many political struggles and seeming defeats, but actually embodying them in terms of Afghan identity. And while I welcome the fact that you quoted Amir Khusro, my heart felt empty because I did not hear the name of Abdul Qadir Bidam. So when I think of Afghanistan, I think of Afghan identity, I don't think of Amir Khusro, who of course did not like Afghans, and we heard his poem. But then I think of Abdul Qadir Bidam, whose tomb I visited in Delhi, but who himself comes from Turkish, and some people say Turkic, Mongol, Afghan background. And the only 2 times that I visited Afghanistan, nobody ever asked me about Khusro, but everybody asked me about Bidam or Bidam. So I would want to ask you, how does the poetry, how does Indo-Persian poetry in general, but Bedil in particular, influence Afghan identity?
I'm not very aware of this poetry that you are referring to. But as far as I know, that all the literature on Afghans, on Afghan identity in the Persianate tradition has a very, very aggressive or a very, very demeaning outlook towards them. But I would definitely like to check out this poetry that you're referring to.
Thank you. Are there other people who have questions or comments?
Can I ask something, please?
Sure. Professor
Okay.
Farhad.
Hi. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Hi, Rajashri. I have two questions for you. First is this, that when you citing from the Babar Nama, so when Babar says that the Afghans were rustic and they were not sensitive, do you think that he has a parameter of comparison? Is he comparing them with some type of people? The first is that. And the second is your comments on Babar's Afghan wife. Your comments on Babar's Afghan wife. And number three, who do you think is that ruler who created a sense of identity amongst the Afghans? So I have three questions for you.
Well, thank you, Professor. I think as far as, the benchmark of all kind of identity, including the Afghans, were the Persianate identity. It was not an ethnic identity because Persianate identity would include people from different backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds, right? So it was not a question of being an Afghan just by blood. It was also by culture, right? Because even the Turks were not they were not Muslims by birth. They converted gradually with the expansion of Islam towards Central Asia. And so did the Iranians, right? So they were not the original Muslims in the sense the Arabs were. So it is not just a question of ethnicity by blood, but the cultural connotations of not adhering to the Persianate traditions of political culture in a very, very broad sense, right? So I think it's not just Afghan by blood, but being an Afghan by culture who lays outside the Persianate realm of culture. Right?
Babar's Afghan wife?
Yeah, so I think that also partially answers that question, that it was more of a political matrimonial alliance, because Babur did forge alliances with a lot of Afghan rulers. So that it was a part of that political alliance, but Babur was also shocked when he saw an Afghan diplomat and Afghan envoy at his court asking to be seated, which was completely against the rules and the ethics of the Persianate court tradition, right? Nobody could sit in the presence of the emperor, including high-ranking nobles. So yeah, so it is not.
His Afghan wife was a great favorite of his daughter, and she calls him by her by a pet name. She's called Afghani Agacha in the Humayun Nama by Gulbadan Begum, and it is this Afghan wife who actually took Babar's remains out of Hindustan to Kabul. So she was quite influential, and there is a love story between Babar and her, which is professed in the documents of the Mughal Empire.
That could be also a way to assert Afghan identity, I think, because it could be.
But but it's coming from the Mughal sources, not the Afghan sources.
Yeah, so that means, then, Professor, that means that such people had a space in the Persianate culture. They had adopted some of those Persianate culture and traditions, and they were not so culturally alien to the Mughals as this person who comes in was. It is much more a question of cultural alienation rather than just of blood.
Could I add something?
Thank you very much. Yeah, another comment? Yes, go ahead, please. Najam.
So I'm not an expert in this time period, but the way that I understand what an Afghan is somebody who is ethnically Pashtun. Now, that is a very debatable topic because for a handful of reasons. And I think if we use that line of thought, I think it is also important to see the point of view from them. So what were the Yusufzai tribes doing during that time? Because the Yusufzai tribes were a large tribe, which, if I understand properly, partially helped Babur and also became enemies to the Mughal. There was some sort of rivalry, right? And then there is also somebody called Khushal Khan Khatak, who, if I understand properly, he was someone who was with the Mughals, but at the end of his life, he changed positions and rebelled against them. And also we have to understand the narratives that come from the Pashtun tribes themselves. For example, I have a friend from the Bangish tribe, and whenever we discuss this subject of Babur and the wars that happened, they have their own narrative. So I think in a way to help us understand and get a different perspective is to see the narratives that the different Afghan Pashtun tribes had at that time period.
Can you please tell me what is the time period of this narrative that you're referring to?
We were just having small talk. Are you talking about the ones on the Bangish?
Okay.
Which one?
I don't think that there are many, there are these narratives don't pertain to this period because I'm specifically talking about the Lodhis and the Surs here, right? So my focus is on the Lodhis, the Surs, and partially on the Karanis of Bengal. But I would like to know if these narratives pertain to the 15th, 16th century, if we could bring that in and bring in some other dimensions of Afghan narratives of this period, then it will be great.
Yeah, let me intervene at this point and say that Najam's question is very apt, but also that your response is very apt, and that we have to think about the time period. And this, of course, is the whole question of living history and then rewriting of history. And this is the dilemma, another one of the dilemmas that we have in a conference like this, where we're talking about identity. There is moments from the past that are invoked, and there are sources from the past that talk about it. But just to quote, one of the things that was said in the very beginning from Professor Farhat's talk about Akbar, it's one thing if you read the Akbarnameh of Abu Fazl, it's another thing if you read Badawani's history, Muntahawa Tawarikh, which is written during the time of Akbar, but not published till 20, 30 years later. So there's the issue of what is history, who writes it, who lives it, who writes it, and how do we remember it? So I think all these elements are in play now. And instead of involving us more in that, I would like to move to the final talk in my session, at least, which comes from a part of history that we've mostly ignored, and nobody will allow us to ignore it for very long. It's called Bengal. And of course, Rajiv knows about it because the relationship between the Biharis and Bengalis could occupy a whole nother conference. And we'd have to make sure of equal representation on all sides. And that would mean that it was a conference would be a melee rather than an academic gathering. But instead of foreshadowing or predicting that kind of an event, let us just say that we're very happy to have a very strong voice from Bengal in the form of the last speaker from Dibaranjan Mondal, who's going to focus on just one Bengali, Rabindranath Tagore, from the 20th century, and also to focus on Rabindranath Tagore's single book, Gora, and with a subtitle of Vistas of History, Nation, and Identity. So 3 of the issues that we've been dealing with, actually, we have only talked a little bit about history, although we've invoked it, but history, nation, and identity, and how it's revealed through Tagore's Gora. So again, if we could have a talk of 12 minutes and then have conversation for 8 minutes afterwards. The floor is yours, Dibaranjan Mandal.
Am I audible, sir? Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, you're audible.
Thank you. First of all, I give my due respect to Rajiv sir, to Umran and all the organizing committee
Excuse me,
And
Devarajan, you might sit back a little bit from your vista. We're seeing your glasses. There you go. Now we can see all of you. Good.
yes, sir.
That's better.
Then Professor Bruce and Professor Heba Rauf, Professor Felix Shibalov, Professor Mousmi Guho Banerjee, for giving me opportunity to present my paper here. The title of my paper is Rereading Tagore's Gora, Rabindranath Tagore's Gora, Vistas of History, Nation and Identity. I am reading out my paper from the remotest village of West Bengal, India, Sundarban. My name is Divaranjan Mondal, research scholar, Shikom Skills University, Birbhum, West Bengal. Rabindranath Tagore's novel, Gora, can be read as a time and mindset occurring after the historical mind of colonization, a time when the colonial, decolonizing, and post-colonial processes and effects can be expressed and examined in literary and political narrative. The novel grows out of the historic events like the Sipayo Mutiny in 1857, Indigo farmers uprising in rural Bengal, also spanning the decade of the 1850s. The 19th century Bengali Renaissance that results the creation of Brahmo Samaj, the counter movement of revivalism of Orthodox Hinduism and the partition of Bengal. The nationalist project of true freedom cannot be achieved due to colonial involvement and Indian Orthodox traditions. The setting of the novel pointed to a period of time that is fragmented and crisis-oriented, and also talks about the role of history in the narrative of the nation in colonial period. All these have combined psychological effect on the indigenous people. Tagore took up the restless crisis and fracturing of Bengali identity revealed by the partition of Bengal and applied to the larger question of the formation of an Indian identity in Gora and establishes coexistence of multicultural through the novel Gora. It is not simply a novel, but the history of thought of Rabindranath concerning India. In the history of the second half of the 19th century, India, the wave of reformation touched Indian temper, culture, and civilization. So, a new mindset to change the world came on the surface. Certainly, great efforts of Raja Rammohn Rai and Ishwar Chandra Bandyopadhyay cannot be denied. Raja Rammohn Rai founded the Brahmo Samaj in 1828, with which he tried to reform the old traditions of Hinduism and check the growing influence of Christianity on the Hindu society. His efforts achieved success in 1829, when the Sati system was abolished. However, the Hindu Widows Remarriage Act in 1856 by Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar was enforced and stirred the then society to a new awakening. Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, a famous writer of Tagore's preceding generation, awakens Indians with a new consciousness of freedom. His novel Anandamart, which was published in 1882, spoke out a song, Vande Mataram, which became national song of national organization and rallying cry of Swadeshi leaders. Side by side, Madhusudan Datta and Dinabandhu Mitra introduced new style in literature prior to Tagore, with an insight of patriotic and religious consciousness. The opportunistic British tactfully divided the then society between the Hindu and the Brahmo. After supporting the ideals of Brahmo Samaj with the hope of freedom and equality, Indians got united and fought the massive battle, the Mutiny of Sipai in 1857. But defeated by the British, Indians became disheartened. At the same time, the founding of Calcutta, Mumbai, and Madras University inspired the country for higher education, although the British government controlled them. Under such socio-political circumstances, Rabindranath Tagore was born. Basically, all these movements and thoughts, especially of religious, literary, and national of Indian Renaissance, influenced Tagore's personality much. Like his father, Rabindranath was deeply influenced by the Upanishad and Buddhism. This built his individuality and spirit of mind. Actually, in Bankim's writing, it was emergent to restore the national self-respect. In Tagore's time, it was how to bridge East and West. In this dynamic age, it is how to identify ourselves with common people. In this post-colonial age, crash of our hopes and deepening despair come into our notice. It is novelist's choice to write fictional narrative on the basis of history. In this framework of literary production, the novelist tries to link between the glories of the remote past and the present servitude of India. The journey from pre-colonial past to the post-colonial future can be read from the world of achievement to the world of non-achievement. In this context, Shishir Kumar Das highlights Bankim Chandra Chatterjee's novel Anandamath to point out that Anandamath is the first Indian novel where dominant political trends of the time merged and were transfused into a myth. And it continued to inspire a large section of the people for more than half a century in its struggle against an imperial power. According to Meenakshi Mukherjee, Rabindranath Tagore is the person who can be said to be the first visionary to create a national consciousness of Indian literature. Tagore was an internationalist. To him, the synthesis of the best of all culture should be our aim. So, the concept of multicultural deconstructs the concept of national culture in the post-colonial period. In the context of culturally diverse countries like India, because it is based on essentialist idea of static culture. There is no single unified cultural identity in a post-national and post-colonial perspective. The act of homogenizing and assimilationist tendencies of the culture of the majority as a mode of thinking has been rejected. Multiculturalism can be viewed as a mode of thinking that can accept the practices, lifestyle, views, and opinions. In short, all minority cultural groups have alternatives rather than deviation. Every culture is internally plural and is continuously evolving by interacting with and borrowing consciously and unconsciously from other cultures. Here, authoritative national identity based on one race, one culture, and one language needs to be deconstructed to make way for multicultural idea of national identity, where nationality is one of the multiple identities of a person, and the nation accepts and celebrates the diversity of race, culture, language, and religion of its people. Rabindranath Tagore, through his novel Gora, talks about the role of history in the narrative of the nation during colonial period. The novel is set in the period of Swadeshi movement against the partition of Bengal. It also reflects Tagore's political concerns, the novel centers around on the issues of nationalism, patriotism, identity, and self-discovery. The nationalist Tagore uses history to describe and rebuild the nation. The Tagore in the novel expresses his views on nationalism. He speaks of civilization approach rather than political. It is true that there is search for identity in the colonized space through introspection and self-interrogation. Basically, aggressive nationalism based on social, religious, gender, and identity is not prioritized. Tagore's novel Gora, written more than 110 years ago, was published in 1910, although it had appeared serially in Probasi, which is a journal edited by Ramananda Chattopadhyay, a close friend of Rabindranath. Actually, it was the last stage of anti-partition movement. The terrorist or revolutionary groups in Bengal are disintegrated. Many are exiled, some jailed, and a few hanged. Tagore had written a poem in this matter to Aurobindo Ghosh, the leader of the movement, who retired to a French colony in South India and replaced politics with spirituality. Gora is influenced by all these. The writer adopts this crucial period of time in Indian history and contextualizes it. His novel also challenges the construction of India as a nation on the basis of an authoritative national identity based on pre-given or constituted historical origin or event. The country was going through a phase of restructuring itself to be born as an independent nation. So resistance movement continues against colonial power structured by the newly educated nationalists. Cultural revivalism as a way of resistance was an attempt to revive the ancient religious and cultural practices at one side, but also to avoid defying attitude of the colonizers to degrade Indian culture as effeminate.
Are you almost done?
Yes, sir.
Are you almost done? We want some time for questions.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Deeparanjan. This is a really interesting Bengali voice mixed with the Afghan and Hindustani and other voices from Uyghurs and Kurds that we heard today. And so I want to ask other people for their questions, but my major question is that you, in your talk, which was very nimble and very artful and gave us many lessons about the role of history in the narrative of nation, you seamlessly referred to pre-Nobel and post-Nobel. So one of the things that is so ironic about Tagore is he's very famous throughout the world today, not only because he was a great poet in India, but because he was the first Asian to receive the Nobel Prize for Literature. So this irony that the Western country where Nobel invented gunpowder, so the person who invented the further development of powder as an instrument of war became the person whose prizes in literature confer something on the one who advocates peace, and that is Tagore. So I wonder if you could comment on the irony of Tagore being a Nobel Prize recipient, but himself opposed to many of the ideas of Alfred Nobel.
Okay, sir. Individual identity cannot be expressed when social identity overpowers the person, and national identity devoid of humanism cannot be integrated. So universalism is a way for the coexistence of multicultural side by side, and thinking for all.
Well, thank you for that. And we have Kalyan Patanayak, who wants to know regarding what you said about Gora, what is the particular appeal of Tagore through the novel Gora, especially to those who may not be Bengali?
Thank you, Kollan Patnaik ji. Actually, Tagore is trying to propagate the actual ideal of the Swadeshi leader. The Swadeshi leaders are very much prone to the self-centric and divide of humanism and believe on one side. But Rabindranath Tagore think that every individual or every part is the part of the universe. So everything is can be regarded as a part of the universe. So we are integrated as the part of the universe. And so internationalism or universal brotherhood or union is the matter. Yeah.
Sir, I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, hi Debaranjan, this is Anuradha. I just want to ask, Gora, which means white. So do you think that there is any symbolic representation of the color in the novel? And my second question is, can Gora be considered as self-paradoxical novel? I hope
Thank
I'm
you.
audible, Debaranjan.
Yes, yes, madam, Anuradha, madam, thank you.
Yeah, please call me Anuradha.
Ma'am, thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Because I am going to present paper tomorrow. Call me Anuradha.
Yes. First question, ma'am. Symbolic representation, Gora, through the opinion of Rabindranath Tagore, is that no man should be bound by any particular class, color, caste, or culture. And each or every individual is a part of the universe. So he or she should think broadly or universally. And so the aim of the human culture is humanism. So this is the symbolic. And ma'am, your second question, the paradox. Yes, there are some parts it appears like debates because there are some instances referred in the novel which talk about paradoxical, because Gora performs some ritual activities, but in reality he cannot perform, or he is referring some other topic. In this way, the novel emerges as paradoxical, I think.
Well, thank you. And thank you. I want to thank Deeparanjan for the excellent talk and then the spirited questions and answers afterwards. But also I want to thank all the other participants, Professor Farhad,
that was a very good.
Rajashree. And we really exceeded our time, but you've all given this a very lively introduction. I hope that Rajiv is pleased with Umran in its green perspective that's now been launched with this wonderful conference. So Rajiv, the last word is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Lawrence, and all the participants for your lovely presentation. I'm sure like it's very beneficial for all humanity actually when we communicate. The communication, what I have learned from Professor Lawrence, interaction is very important. Network. And the most beautiful thing that from this symposium, especially for this session, I learned that Professor Lawrence said, like, different voices from different country. So he mentioned from, different countries, and that really fascinated me. I learned from this a lot. So we have a now break of 30 minutes. And after that, we are going to meet again, and Professor Banerjee will be chairing. And so please be on time. And thank you, all of you, and Professor Lawrence especially. Thank you very much. So see you again.
Welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you all, thank you all.